Mr. Meiklejohn.
I'm Tom Meiklejohn. I am also the same person I was yesterday, but I wasn't here. So I'll just briefly introduce myself by saying I've worked in labor relations or as an advocate in labor relations for, well, since 1977, however long that is. 12 years as a field employee with the National Labor Relations Board, and the rest of that 25 years or so as a representative of unions. And in that time, one of the more dramatic changes I've seen is in the practice of unions with respect to keeping their campaigns quiet and concealed from the employer. And in the early days of my employment, it was almost always the case that the unions tried to keep things under a lid for right up until the petition was filed. And you would have something that those unfriendly to that tactic could refer to as an ambush election. But today, that's changed, and that is the very rare exception where the union doesn't go public with their campaign. And there's at least three reasons for that. One is because if the union, in order to build strength, has to overcome regardless of what the employer has done or said in the past. Employees come into the campaign knowing that their employer is going to oppose the campaign in almost every case, and fearing the employer's reaction. And the first phase of that campaign is to build up the confidence amongst the employees that they can join together to speak up for themselves. And then, in order to get that message to the larger group of employees, there has to be some committee, some group of people who are willing to go public, have their faces on campaign literature, to have their names disclosed as the people who are willing to lead the campaign. And once that happens, the employer knows that there's something going on. The second reason for this is quite simply that if you end up in litigation, whether somebody was discriminated against because of their union activity, you want to be able to show that it was public. You know, if it's been concealed, you have a much, much harder time proving that. And then the third reason is because it doesn't work to keep it secret. In spite of Mr. Washington's limited, or his experience, my experience is that the word gets to the employer and the employer knows who the leaders are. And so if you hide that information, then you expose those employees to pressures without the protections of the Act. With respect to the employer's Section 8C and constitutional rights to present their opinions, the employer is free to start expressing those opinions from the day the employees are hired. And many employers, Target, Walmart, we know the classic examples, many employers take advantage of that. Some employers may not. But I would submit that the law gives the employers the right to express their opinions. It doesn't give them an obligation to go out and formulate an opinion, and it doesn't require you to give the employers time to figure out what that opinion is. They have however long an employee is working at the facility to express those opinions. If they choose to do that, they have the opportunity. If they choose not to, they're not being deprived of the right to speak. I would note, however, and maybe this is a flip comment, but an earlier panel member talked about educating employees of their rights. The board has developed a notice, and the court says you can't force employers to post that notice. But if the employer wants to educate the employees about their rights, they can voluntarily post those notices, and the employees will have that information. I have, one other, maybe some people sometimes think it's a radical suggestion to look at the statute. But the language of Section 9A says that representatives designated or selected by a majority of employees shall be the exclusive representative. And for the first, you talked about the history of the act a little earlier. Is it Miss Gamara or Mishamara?
I'm not sure from every
Okay.
passing day. But I think Miss Camara.
Ms. Gamera, okay. The first 20 or 30 years of the history of the Act, the big issue was, does an employer confronted with the signatures of a majority of its employees have the right to insist upon an election? And we've come to the point where that issue seems to be settled, that an employer has the right to refuse to grant recognition based upon a card majority, if the employer so chooses. But we've now taken that debate from 20 or 30 years ago, and you're taking it to another whole level, and we're arguing not only does the employer have the right to refuse to recognize the signatures of its employees, but it has the right to then launch a campaign to convince the employees to change their minds. And I would submit there are many instances where the law requires employees have a chance to think things over before they decide. But when the employee is hired and he signs a non-compete agreement, a confidential information agreement, and an individual arbitration agreement, which he has no choice but to sign when he's hired, he's considered to be an adult who's bound by what he's agreed to. And I think that this statute that you're charged with enforcing calls upon you to treat, in spite of what Mr. Hogan said, the law considers the employees not to be children, but to be adults. And if they've made the choice to sign a union card, then the law, that choice should be given the same respect as is given to these other documents that employees are required to sign in order to get a job. And if we're going to accept the law requires that decision be confirmed, the point of the election is to confirm, this is what the court said before I started the practice. The purpose is to confirm that they want to be represented by the union. If the purpose of the election is to confirm that choice, it should not be to give the employer an opportunity to convince them to change their minds. The law doesn't require that. So I'm speaking, I may have not said this, but I'm in favor of the language of the proposed rule.
We picked that up.
Okay.
I do have some follow-up, but I want to defer to my fellow members.
Go ahead.
Okay. I assume you don't want us to ignore Chamber of Commerce versus Brown, because it does establish that freewheeling discussion of labor issues is basically what Congress wanted to protect. And without needing to go back to whether prior Supreme Court decisions recognize that or not, I mean, are we free to ignore a Supreme Court decision on this?
No, you're not free to ignore a Supreme Court decision, but that does not mean that you have to enforce the act in a fashion designed to facilitate or encourage a campaign designed to get employees to change a decision that they've made. Yes.
Okay, but
you can't. Section 8 says you can't stop the. I'm sorry.
No, I understand, and you have a very good point, is that the process rules might be different than the substance rules, but at some point they do intersect. And if the Supreme Court is telling us that employees have a right, an underlying right to receive information opposing unionization, I don't think we can construct a process that says, forget about that. But I think that the question about authorization cards is a very interesting one, and I appreciate all your passion that you bring to these proceedings. No, I do.
I intended to stay more calm.
No, it was a very illuminating presentation you just made. I guess my follow-up is more, look, 30% is the showing of interest. Theoretically, there could be 70% of people who don't support a union. There are people who can change their minds during a campaign. The law on showing of interest, the reason why it is immune from collateral attack is it is what it says, just a showing of interest. So you're not advocating that we should interpret authorization documents as binding contractual documents, that then we should basically write our election process to simply ignore the fact that employees might change their minds, are you?
I'm not suggesting that employees don't have the right to change their minds. I'm
Okay.
suggesting the act doesn't embody the principle that employers have a right to a period of time in which to try to do that.
Right. Well, that's certainly not written explicitly in the statute, but Section 8C is, and although it doesn't apply directly to representation proceedings, do you think Section 8C has any bearing on this?
Yeah, 8C says that the labor board does not have the right to find it to be unlawful for an employer to exercise its First Amendment rights. But this may seem like a wild suggestion or analogy, but I mean, our Supreme Court obviously also says that people with lots of money are entitled to use that money for speech purposes. So it doesn't necessarily follow that if I disagree with what the Koch brothers have to say, that I'm entitled to be given billions of dollars to express that opinion. So the board can't stop the employer from speaking, but the board doesn't have to.
Subsidize the employer is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
it.
no,
That is, yeah. At least
understand. So-
I'm glad my analogy made some sense.
Right.
to
No,
you.
I see where you're going. But what is
Okay,
the
good.
point between cutting into Section 8C and free speech rights and subsidization in your view?
It's either finding it to be. I would start with the language of the statute again, which is that it cannot find it to be an unfair labor practice.
No, I'm talking about timeline-wise. Sorry.
I'm saying I don't think that the statute
Okay.
requires any time. I would agree
So
with
it's-
Mr. Hermanson that the election should be held the day the petition's filed.
It's
But
basically
I do.
zero.
The
From a
purpose of-
process point of view.
Pardon?
From a process point of view, it's basically zero.
Right.
Okay, and then just one last thing. Would your view change on any of this, because I know you've been involved in seeing the shift in union strategies, if the board actually had a notice requirement, and we could say that disposes of the free speech issue, if there was a pre-petition sort of notice requirement, or do you think that's unnecessary?
Well, I think it's unnecessary, first
Okay.
of all. But I have another answer to the question.
Sure.
Because it's not a complete surprise. I've been thinking about it since you first raised it a couple panels ago. One of the points that I made is that the organizing campaign starts with a period or a phase in which the union is building up for want of a better word, the courage of the employees to band together and stand together. And I think that and unions do keep their campaign secret at that point, because at that point the employees can can very easily be intimidated by either legal or illegal conduct. It doesn't have to be illegal in my view. And so I think that there is good reasons to preserve the right of unions to keep that first phase of the campaign secret. And I think if you try to come up with a bright line rule, you're going to tread on that.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meiklejohn.